Well, welcome back to the Encounter Faith podcast, everybody. My name is Ross, and I have the privilege of having these conversations. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jeffrey Barbeau. You're going to hear me call him Jeff because the podcast we just had before I hit record was highly entertaining. So, Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
I'm happy to be here. It's great.
Now, before I dive into some of the things I wanted to ask you about, just, you are a known face around here at Good Shepherd. You and your lovely family have been a part of this church now for a little bit, but can you help folks know what you do, not on a Sunday morning, so that people have a better understanding of why you and I might be talking?
I mean, is there really anything other than Sundays? Honestly.
Great point. Great point. I'm so glad someone finally said it.
Sunday is a big part of life, not just because of football in the afternoon or something like that, but
Mhm.
because of church, and it is a big deal. And so my wife and I are really happy to be there with our kids and all that stuff. But beyond that, I do work at Wheaton College. I've been there for 18 years. I've been teaching full time for over 20 years. And I work in theology. So I teach systematic theology, historical theology, but I also work pretty heavily in literature. So I work on British literature especially, and those two come together in my research and writing quite a lot. But my teaching is mostly in the theology and sort of interdisciplinary connections with literature.
Yeah. Now there's a small subset of I don't Barbeau fanatics, Dr. Barbeau fanatics, who are part of our theology cohorts. Um, Here, listen, because you come highly recommended in that regard. So shout out to all of you who listen to a part of the cohort program. If you're not, I do want you to check out the links in the show notes because that team is getting ready to launch year 2 of that program, and it has been genuinely life changing for a lot of the folks who've participated in it so far. So really, genuinely, all the jokes aside, excited about what God's doing there. But what I want to ask about is kind of this intersection of literature and theology that you just sort of outlined in your expertise. And those two worlds don't, I think there's a false perception that people have, which is that those things won't necessarily intersect. How do you relate these two things? How do you describe how your love, passion for theology intersects with your love, passion for literature?
So I don't want to tell too long a story here, but I will say when I was a kid, I loved stories, but I wasn't like super, reading all the time. I wasn't like the kid with my nose in a book all the time, but I read a lot. And as I was in high school, I remember really liking literature and being pretty captivated by novels and stories of different types and just thinking it was pretty fantastic. But I was really deepening in my faith at the same time. And I think subtly I was getting a message from some quarters that suggested that, if you really loved the Lord, you would focus in on the Bible, and it meant direct ministry through like pastoral care or missions. And so I started to get the kind of message that like novels, theater, the arts, that those were secondary, maybe, tertiary at best, right? They weren't the main thing to do. So that actually took me a long time to figure out. And by the time I was in undergrad, later years of undergrad, I started to rethink this and actually started doing some writing that was in theology and literature, but I felt a little bit like I was just sort of making it up as I was going along. I was trying to figure it out. I was reading some works out there on theology and literature, but it wasn't self-evident how to do it. And I didn't really, although I had some great profs who mentored me, they weren't directly trying to get me to go down that road. So it's something I stumbled into. I think the only other thing I'll mention, maybe you just, feel free to jump in here with some other questions, is
Yeah.
that literature does different things than theology does. And so when we think about our faith, if you go down the road of literature, it it can make people uncomfortable. I mean, even here at Wheaton College, which is a liberal arts school with really thoughtful Christians, I have a number of students that if I introduce a work of literature, there is a certain amount of discomfort they might have if I want to say, let's talk about theology as a result of this work, because it's
Right.
less concrete.
Yeah. And that's what I find so fascinating because I think for so many folks, their lived experience in the church is expecting things to be concrete or wanting that Sunday morning experience to feel very concrete. sort of in opposition to what they experience before they walk in the doors of wherever they go to church. And what I really like about having an expert like you is you found in this intersection a way to strengthen your own theology, to reinforce and build and continue to grow in your beliefs, but use this thing, to use the broadest term, literature, that is probably more analogous to how you live your life Monday through Saturday. And I think
Yeah.
that's, especially in this moment, there's part of what I think folks are looking for in the church is a church that's willing to acknowledge what my life looks like in a Monday through Saturday sense, not just expecting Sunday to be this island of holy huddles. And that's where I can sort of begin to like tie this back into this current moment, because one of my favorite things from the world of communications is I get really frustrated with churches in sort of a Christian conversation because we have the best story ever told.
Mhm.
That's why so many movies, so many books have the Christ story in them, because it's the best story ever told. And yet we often reduce that to sort of to be two-dimensional or be too rigid, like I'm saying. To ask perhaps a little bit of an unfair question, one of the things that I think is really cool is I feel like you have a bigger, and in my belief at least, more biblical idea of like Christian imagination than what some folks are able to experience because of your background and because of your expertise with stories and literature. But when, to use the example you're describing with those students, how do you help your students who might have that initial discomfort work through that? Because I would, at least from my side of the fence, go, you're helping them experience more of who God is through this story.
Yeah, I think there's a couple thoughts. One is that to work with literature in matters of faith is not to say like anything goes or anything
Right.
you read is therefore good news,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
And
that's
I
an
think
important
I
starting
think
point.
that's part of the discomfort, right? Is that, well, if I read this thing, then of course, if I like it, like if I find the story compelling,
Yeah.
or I find certain characters compelling, or the plot line, right? Then therefore that's the same as approving of it. So that's
Okay.
the first thing. That's a
Yeah.
distinction. There are plenty of stories I like or I enjoy that I wouldn't say necessarily reflect my core values or my beliefs,
Sure.
but they're really great stories,
Yeah.
and they may be, even by difference or similarity, they cause me to reflect on my faith and cause me to ask new questions. But I think this is the second point, is that task is best done with a strong grounding of beliefs.
Mhm.
So, not strong grounding of beliefs like they're without conversation, but like knowing the scriptures, having the bedrock of the Bible is a really great thing to have as you're engaged in this process, and understanding where the churches have kind of put their focus in
Mhm.
things like the creeds, right? The Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and so forth, or the sort of confessional statements that churches have. That can be a great way to engage in literature in a sense that will make that conversation come alive, right?
Yeah.
Because then you're not just anchorless. You are engaged in a real dialogue with a
Mhm.
work. And that's where the fun is, I think, actually, because you might
100%.
find a story really compelling, and you're like with it. But then what do we do with it? Now what?
Exactly. I mean, if you've talked to Dr. Barbeau, you might find he could give you a great reading list of a lot of very impressive books. And if you talk to me, I might give you some SNL sketches to check out, because I think really I resonate with that so much for me with background in comedy, because the amount that I can appreciate a joke with going like, I could never make that joke because I have a different belief system, or I morally it's offensive to me, but I can understand the well-structured nature of that joke, to where it goes too far, where I have to then become against that as a joke, it is something I genuinely get to experience all the time. But it worries me sometimes when I see folks in the church reject everything that isn't strictly from the church, because then I question how folks like that can be um, in the world but not of it.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious for you, seeing folks who are in this college setting, you're seeing these folks who are in this really specific formative time, obviously, to say maybe the most obvious sentence ever. Where that I get curious about that is, I imagine in teaching, you're helping students wrestle with some of these questions. And it's also helping you as a dad, as someone figuring it out yourself. Like, you're continually having to wrestle with some of that, where you might be uncomfortable, where you might be wrestling with something because you're watching kids wrestle with it for the first time.
Totally. And I think that's the beauty of the work I get to do. And I tell my students all the time, like, it is really a privilege to be able to do this for a living, because I get to come into their lives and ask them difficult questions and provide resources that can help them come to hopefully better or more thought out answers, especially when they're evaluating kind of what are their own beliefs as they're stepping away from home for the first time. My goal is not to, cast them against the rocks, but rather to help them out as they're sorting out their own place in the big picture.
Yeah.
And in many ways, I want to send them back to their churches stronger than they were before.
Right.
And like, what does that look like then for you to think about these things? So yeah, and I think also, to go to your earlier point, like, Sunday is Sunday, and Monday through Saturday is where we have to do a lot of negotiating about a lot of things in life.
Mm-hmm.
And so the skills you can get from studying faith and literature together are the same ones you need actually in ordinary life to discern, like, so much, like all the TV we watch, all of our kind of cultural expressions, our politics, our economics. Like, there's so many ways we need these skills to be able to discern and reflect, and that's an ongoing process.
And I'm glad that's where you landed too, because I also think if the longer you're in the church, the more likely it is that you want the systems that you had at one point to exist forever. Meaning it's an ongoing process, and it's a process that you have to constantly reevaluate within your own faith expression.
Mhm.
It's a simple example, but I remember being a tour guide in college and being a brand new Christian, and my very much not Christian boss in admissions was like, "Ross, you like Jesus, right?" And I was like, "I just met him." And the reason she asked the crass question was because there was some VIP kid who was choosing between the school I went to and Olivet,
Mhm.
which is hilarious in hindsight for like 400 different reasons.
Sure.
But what I remember saying to her family was like, "Look, I've been a Christian for like 4 minutes, so take that with a grain of salt. But also, what I really like being around people who don't all think the way that I do. And
Mm.
I think if you go to a school like that, you're going to have to figure out, is that where you want to be?"
Yeah.
Now that I've matured longer than 4 minutes of belief, it's very, what I wish I had said to that 17-year-old kid was, this actually might be the perfect place for you, or this
Mm.
might be the worst place for you for your faith. And you
Mm.
might very much benefit from being at Olivet because you want those roots to grow. Um,
Yeah.
and I have to do that work constantly. You have to do that work constantly, as do your students. But that it brings me into this time of year, because I think a short way to describe the tension that some churches wrestle with, and why I'm very grateful to be a part of a liturgical church, is at Good Shepherd, we don't tell the story of Easter until we've walked through Lent.
Mm.
And not that you're, um, not that this is where like the center of your gifting, but just as a matter of opinion, I am curious how you look at the story of Lent in relation to the story of Easter,
Mm.
because every time I've done this, where I take Lent seriously, I get so much more out of Easter. And every
Yeah.
time I blow past Lent, Easter is just another day on the calendar. But what does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a really it's a interesting question because I think people who listen to this will have their own varied backgrounds as
Mhm.
to what they think of when someone says Lent. For some people, it might be, Mardi Gras and everything that's afterwards.
Right.
It might be Fish Fridays.
Yeah.
It might be Holy Week itself and certain services, maybe. Um, Maybe it has a really kind of negative tone to it. It's like time to give things up, or it
Hmm.
becomes a kind of self-help uh, kind of time of life, kind of like a New Year's, except like fresh resolutions a couple months later.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
these
Oh
are
yeah.
all real possibilities,
For
right?
sure. Oh yeah.
And for me, the interesting thing, I have a Methodist background, both when I was very young and then again when I was in my 20s. But in my teens and college years, I was in non-denominational churches, and there was very little sign of anything liturgical in terms of the church calendar or anything like that. And so it's interesting how, for me, when I returned to Methodism, it was in part a sense of deeper connection with
Mm.
ages past.
Yeah.
And I love the vibe of, contemporary services. And there's when I go to our contemporary service, I always am like, oh, that's right. This is so like beautiful and wonderful. And there's a
Yeah.
real intimate, experience there. But one of the things I love about the church calendar and Lent in particular is that it calls me to something that I may not actually feel ready for. And that's really profound, right? So
Hmm.
it is a time where I'm called to join in something that Christians have been doing for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. And it's not based on like, am I in the mood to do this or not? It is it is solely based on, well, I'm a Christian and this is what Christians do.
I love that.
So it's like it kind of is a jolt for me, honestly. It takes me out of you know, my mood.
Yeah. I had never considered that way. I love the idea of us needing Lent to truly celebrate Easter, but also for folks, if you feel like Lent snuck up on you,
Mhm.
recognizing the opportunity in that, because Ash Wednesday's on the calendar. You can Google Ash Wednesday 2075, and I think they will tell you when that day is going to be there, whether or not you, dear listener, will be there. Um, but I think what's so also helpful for me in hearing you articulate that is it gives people permission to show up as they are, to
Mhm.
experience what the church has to offer,
Mhm.
rather than having to put on pretense before they, come get communion or any sort of aspect of the church. And it brings me back to where we started around theology, because that act in and of itself of showing up as you are naturally lends itself to a deeper theology, a less two-dimensional theology, and frankly, a better story. And one of the things that I'm curious about for you, just as a dad, is how you are connecting some of these themes for your kids,
Mhm.
because how you and your wife are doing that, because it, I think for a lot of people listening, I like to talk to professors particularly because you guys read all the books. In some of your cases, you wrote some of the books. And then when you're a professor as a parent, you go, oh, wait, I know the answer, but now there's a person in front of me and I don't understand how they're supposed to function in that way, right? Because I have the answer, but how do I actually live this out? And I think it mirrors the experience that any devoted or Christian has, or someone who's been following Jesus for a long time, because we are supposed to know the answers because we've been doing this for a decade or two or three or four, or some of you five.
Mhm.
How do you, to go back to the beginning of the soapbox I just got on, how do you show up as you are with your wife, with your kids, um, and help them understand some of what we've been talking about?
Well, I'll tell you, number one, I'll say I just love the partnership I have with my wife because we try to be thoughtful about this together.
Yeah.
And she so often encourages me, and I do my best to encourage her. And I think we want to form our kids as a part of like making them good citizens, you might say,
Mm,
but also citizens of the kingdom. We want to form them in the practices of faith. And we want them to see themselves as a part of a really long story and like go back because Lent, began in the fourth century. It was originally a time of preparation for baptism. Easter was when you did baptisms. And so the idea was, all right, these candidates for baptism, they're going to be fasting and praying. Maybe the minister will be joining in on this eventually. It's like, hey, ministers should do this too. And it expands, right? So when I take my family to an Ash Wednesday service or a
mm,
Holy Week service, in a way, I'm joining in to this much longer practice that's been here since, the 300s,
mm,
and God willing, will continue on for centuries and centuries and centuries, millennia ahead until the Lord returns, right?
mhm.
And and that's something bigger than them, my kids, and me and my wife.
Yeah,
we're
that's
we're
good.
participating in something that's quite powerful, and it can feel rather ordinary and mundane. It's like, oh man, I got to find time to get to this service. I got to get
Right.
my kids together. We got to get our homework done earlier, right? There's all that practical stuff. Oh, maybe there's a practice or there's a game or whatever. But we're Christians. This
Yep.
is what we do.
Hmm.
So we show up, right? And I want them to feel that that's like normal. That's the ordinary, faithful thing that Christians do. And if that's their identity, then that identity supersedes the other fun stuff that we also do, which is the games and the friendships and the homework and all the rest of it. But their identity is in Christ. So we head to church and we expect, even if we're not ready, that going through the motions actually isn't an entirely bad thing. Like I know culturally there's this whole like, oh, I don't want it to be going through the motions. I want it to be powerful every time. But actually having like lived on the wild side in my teenage years of like the church life, there's
100%.
something there's something about going through the motions that is stabilizing.
Hmm.
And again, it's that larger identity, that larger story. And we want that for our kids. We want that to be formative for their own lives as they grow up.
1,000%. I like to say, because dear listener, you may have even heard me say this on the podcast a few times. The majority of any church is made up of folks who have always been in the church. Depending on what study you read, it's 40 to 60 to 80% of people who are part of the church as adults became a part of the church between the ages of 4 and 14. And that's why I always encourage people, talk to the other 20%, talk to the adult converts in your life, talk to the folks who walked away from the church, because they will remind you how significant it is and how you could be anywhere else and you chose to be there, even if all you can do is go through the motions.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, especially because we have some kids who are around the same age, like, especially when I look at the future of the church that they are inheriting,
Mhm.
the ability to just have it feel, oh, this is just the normal thing to do
Mhm.
is going to continue to bear fruit, continue to be powerful, and Lord willing, continue to sustain them into that future.
Yeah, totally. And I think actually, again, this is my Wesleyan kind of Methodist background, is what we refer to these moments as they're kind of means of grace. So
Mm,
we think of the Lord's Supper and baptism, they're sacraments and they're powerful and they're in a sense unique. But there are all sorts of other ordinary practices we have that we might call sacramental, or they are means of grace. They're ways that God um, touches our lives through seemingly ordinary practices,
sure.
whether that's meeting in a class, hearing a sermon. It's sharing prayer with others, going and serving meals, or helping out in your community. Those are opportunities where God can meet you. And I actually think in some ways we almost miss the fact that a time like Lent, when we feel called back to a more careful devotion to
Hmm.
those sorts of things, prayer, Bible reading,
Hmm. Hmm.
acts of devotion, and services like Ash Wednesday or during Holy Week. Like these are opportunities for God to graciously meet us. And, so on the one hand, I want to say, hey, go through the motions. But the reason I can say that so confidently is because I think that in unexpected ways, not every time, there will be these moments where you're like, wow, this was a means of grace, where
Hmm.
unexpectedly something happens in your life and you encounter the work of the Holy Spirit. And that's one of the reasons we do it too.
Yeah, that's really good. What I hope folks particularly pay attention to is how in that framework that Jeff's laying out there, God's doing the work. Because I think so often we're showing up, and part of the reason why we want this thing to feel profound is because we're trying to speak for myself. When I feel that way, I am trying to sort of compensate for some sort of area of lack where I'm going, well, no, this needs to be profound because I need to sort of make up for the different things that I didn't do throughout the course of the week or whatever it is. And those simple practices can really be all that's needed because of God's generosity. Um, you've been already been very generous with your time. Where I think it's going to be a helpful place for us to land the plane here is actually just really based off of that idea around practices. Because knowing a little bit of your background, dear listener, uh, I was part of one dinner with Jeff and his family. It was great, and I look forward to many more. Um, but knowing a little bit of your background, I think you can speak to this tension that some folks have where you have this experience, I have this experience where people find out what we do and folks start doing that kind of like I call it like the confessional walk back, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, like I love being in church, not like every week, but like we got a lot of stuff going on. But then, well, I did watch SNL that one time, right? Like, and it's these things where I so just want to tell people like, hey, I just wanted to, grab my coffee, right? Like, and that just, it's so often folks are putting up barriers. And in those practices, there are simple ways for folks to feel called back, to draw back. And Lent is a wonderful time of year to do that.
Mhm.
Whether it's based off of your experience, research, or just your own life, I'm curious if there's someone who's listening who like wants what we're describing, but doesn't know how to get it. What's a particular practice or practices that you feel like are most beneficial to that person who is particularly curious this time of year?
Well, I think for one thing, it's worth saying that just showing up is a key step. And sometimes things in church can feel like you got to know all the right moves, and really it's just like going in the door
Yeah.
and being there, right? I think it's worth saying, secondly, that there's times in our lives when the idea of like giving up something more for Lent or whatever is feels like a heavy burden.
Yeah.
And I know there's been times in my life when I've said, my whole life is a Lent. I don't really need to do anything else right now. You know,
Yeah. Oh
and
yeah.
it's a funny way of saying a truth, which
Yep.
is like sometimes life is just not good.
Hmm.
And and I think that if we can acknowledge that it's not about like the extra stuff you're doing, it's just showing up. When I was in really one of the toughest parts of my life, when I was really down the depths, uh, I remember distinctly that just showing up was about all I could do. And I remember in particular this one service I was in. I don't know that it was during Lent, but it felt like a Lent time of my life. And I remember I was sitting there and it was a time of worship and there was singing. And all I could do was just weep
Mm.
in the service. But I heard while I was weeping the voices of these people that I was in that community with. I could hear them singing, and for some, maybe their hands were in the air. But I remember a sense that I didn't know what else I could do to worship except stand there and cry. But the church worshiped for me. And I think there's times in our lives when Lent feels heavy, and maybe all we can manage is to just show up and stand there and cry. But that's okay. Like that's enough. And so none of this is meant to be a heavy weight. It's actually the place where I think the weight gets lifted. And that's if people walk away from this here in this podcast with that sense that you're joining into something greater, um, and it doesn't really require like a superhuman effort on your part to be a part of that story,
Hmm.
then that's a good thing.